We're about to get started. Can you all hear me? Okay, excellent. Good evening, and welcome to the David C. Hardesty Jr. Festival of Ideas at West Virginia University. My name is Mary Ann Reed, and I'm the Dean of the WVU College of Media. Tonight's panel discussion is sponsored by the College of Media, the Ogden Newspapers Seminar Series, and the Festival of Ideas, WVU's premier speaker series. David Hardesty organized the first Festival of Ideas when he was a student leader at WVU in the 1960s. When he became the university's president in 1997, he relaunched the festival, which now spans the entire academic year and engages a diverse group of newsmakers, public figures, thought leaders, and WVU's own superstars. David and Susan are here tonight, and I would just like to take a moment and all of us thank you for your generosity that has kept this series going. We're excited to continue in the tradition that you started, David. Tonight's panel is called Journalism on the Front Lines, covering the Trump administration. Here's why we called it that. From the earliest days of the Republic, every American president has tangled with reporters. Presidents want their agenda to be presented in the most positive light, but journalists believe that they are responsible for keeping political power in check. They see their role as watchdogs of democracy, whose work is protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. So there's always been a pull and tug and a back and forth in the relationship between the president and the press. But less than a year into his presidency, the relationship between President Donald Trump and the media has been particularly adversarial. Let's take a look at this short video.
Another important issue for Americans is integrity in journalism. These people are among the most dishonest people I've ever met, spoken to, done business with. These are the most dishonest people.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
Since you're attacking us, can you give us a question? No, Mr. President-elect.
Go ahead.
Mr. President-elect, since you are attacking our news organization, can you give us a chance?
Your organization
You are attacking our news organization.
Your organization.
Can you give us a chance to ask a question, sir?
Go ahead.
Sir, can you state, Mr. President-elect,
Go ahead.
can you state categorically,
she's asking a question. Don't
Mr.
be rude.
President-elect, can you give us a question?
Don't be
You're
rude.
attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude. No, I'm not going to give you a question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir.
During tonight's discussion, a panel of White House correspondents will describe firsthand what it's been like to cover the Trump administration, what they've experienced, what they've learned, and how they're managing in what appears to be a very difficult situation. I want to acknowledge from the outset that this is a sensitive topic. Emotions can run high, so I would ask that all of you in the audience keep an open mind. Let's keep the dialogue at a high level, and let's treat our panelists and each other with respect in true mountaineer fashion. Luckily, the man who's moderating tonight's discussion, he is a master of handling difficult conversations. Often referred to as the Dean of West Virginia Broadcasters, Hoppy Kercheval joined West Virginia Radio Corporation in 1976. A founding father of Metro News, the state radio network, Kercheval served as news director until assuming the role of vice president of operations in 1991. In 1993, he created Metro News Talk Line, which has become a signature program of the network. Kercheval's gift of interviewing has made Talk Line a must-listen for lawmakers and anyone interested in state politics and the day's top news events. He has received a number of honors over the year, including the Mel Burka Award, given annually by the West Virginia Broadcasters Association to the state's top broadcaster. Most recently, Kercheval was inducted into the West Virginia Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Hoppy is also a proud alumnus of the P.I. Reed School of Journalism, which is now the College of Media. Let's give a warm WVU welcome for Hoppy Kercheval.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you very much. And thanks for coming out tonight. David, thank you for your work on this. The School of Media has assembled an outstanding fake panel tonight. So, I was a slip. I'm sorry. We didn't mean that. But this is a great panel. We've had dinner here and talked to them, and I think you're going to really enjoy meeting them, hearing from them. We're encouraging a good dialogue here among them, and also at the end there'll be a chance for you to ask questions of them and make comments. And I think they can handle anything that you can. They cover the White House, so they can handle anything that you can throw at them, figuratively, not literally. So let's keep that in mind. Please welcome, first of all, from the New York Times, Mark Lander. Mark, come on up. Mark is a White House correspondent at the Times, 24 years at the New York Times. He's been a diplomatic correspondent, bureau chief in Hong Kong and Frankfurt, a European economic correspondent, and a business reporter in New York. He drove like a maniac over here to get here in time after being at a White House briefing just this afternoon. Please welcome Mark Landler. Tara McKelvey is with the BBC, and Tara McKelvey is a White House reporter for the British Broadcasting Company. Prior to her current position, McKelvey was a correspondent for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and has reported on topics which include national security issues from the Middle East, South Asia, and Russia. Tara, welcome. Good to have you here. Catherine Skiba is with the Chicago Tribune, Washington correspondent for the great newspaper, the Tribune. She writes about the White House, Congress, federal agencies, politics and campaigns, policy, political contributions, public corruption. Today, I tried to get her on the show. She said, I'm too busy. I'm on deadline. So it's great to have her here today. She's been based in Washington since 2000 and has reported on 4 presidents, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. Please welcome Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. Sarah Westwood is with the Washington Examiner. She's a White House reporter for the Examiner, previously covered local government for the Marietta, Georgia Daily Journal. Sarah Westwood appears frequently on Fox News, Fox Business, CNN, and many talk radio programs, including WMAL's Morning on the Mall and WTOP News in Washington, D.C. Sarah, good to have you here. Thanks for coming. So grab your microphones and get ready to go. And as you can see, we got a little bit of a left-right. I don't want to just categorize them that way, but it's a little bit of a left-right mix here. So that should be pretty good as well. We're going to start each of them with just an opening comment. And Mark, let me start with you. So what is it like now? You've been around for a while. What's it like now in that media briefing room and working with this administration?
Bumpy.
Bumpy.
First of all, thank you
Yes.
for having me. It's great to be at West Virginia University. I've never been to Morgantown. It's really beautiful. I guess what I would say is it's less turbulent than it was at the very beginning. I think that the first couple of months of this White House were particularly antagonistic and difficult. In the last few weeks, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I sense that things have settled down a little bit, which I attribute to a couple of factors. One, John Kelly coming over from the Department of Homeland Services to be chief of staff. I think he's kind of battened down the hatches a little bit in the West Wing. He's clamped down on some of the sort of dysfunction, some of the leaking. He's tried to regularize the processes a little bit. And then also the departure of Sean Spicer, I think has made a difference. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the current press secretary, I wouldn't describe her relationship with the press as warm, but she has gone back to instituting daily on-camera briefings. That was something that Sean stopped doing for a period of time, which poses a huge problem, in particular for the TV networks. But that decision was sort of symptomatic of a broader antagonism and mistrust between the White House and the press. And I think that Sarah is actually trying to address that in some fashion. I'm not going to pretend that things are anywhere close to normal, because this is a White House, as you saw a moment ago on the screen, that has made vilifying the media a central part of its strategy. So that's going to kind of lead to tough, tense relations regardless. But I do think that in the last couple of weeks, I've detected a kind of a small shift in mood. And, I hope it's a trend that will continue. It's hard to predict because ultimately the mood of the White House is set by the person who sits in the Oval Office. And President Trump has had a busy couple of weeks responding to hurricanes. He's actually got some of the first good headlines of his presidency across the board for, some bipartisan moves he's made on debt negotiations. He's having dinner tonight with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. So it's been a kind of an interesting, slightly different period in the Trump presidency, and I think that's also reflected in the mood between the press corps and the White House.
Thank you. Tara, what's it been like?
Crazy, totally crazy. Can you hear me all right?
1, 2, 1. We'll just pass it over. Okay, we'll get this one.
Is this better? So
Check,
anyway,
check.
it's
Wait
completely
a minute.
crazy at the White House. And just a couple of things. I wanted to give you a little sort of preamble. 5 things that I've learned since covering the White House, just to sort of give you a sense of what it's like. And then before I do that, I just want to say that during the campaign, people said that reporters took Donald Trump took him literally but not seriously, and the American public took Donald Trump seriously but not literally. And I think that explains in some ways the discrepancy between how the American people often see the Donald Trump White House and how the reporters see the White House. It's very different. And the things that I've learned since covering the White House, briefly. So number 1, the president likes reporters. He likes some of them, not all of them. When I flew with him to Paris over the summer, he spent an hour with us, and he was talking to us, and it was a little bit like in one of those old movies, like in the Front Page or something, when those newspaper movies where they have the newspapers twirling around, and the politicians are talking to the reporters as if they're friends. It was a lot like that. And the number 2 thing that I've learned is that the president is really good at working the media. He understands camera angles, and he understands the importance of sound. Once, over a weekend at Mar-a-Lago at his resort in Florida, he complained because the camera angles were wrong. And then at a rally in Phoenix, he also complained about the way things looked. And cameramen and sound men appreciate that about him. He understands the technology and also tradecraft of the media. And the other thing that he does when he talks to people is he has a certain strategy, and if he's facing a somewhat hostile-ish group, he'll single out a person. He does this with journalists, and he also does with heads of state. So he'll choose a journalist in the pack, and he'll say, like when we were flying to Paris, he would call one of the journalists sweetie, or like once he sort of pointed out at me in the crowd, and he said, "You're the nice one." So he chooses a person to sort of side with, and then he'll say, you and I it's me and you against the world kind of attitude, and you sort of like fall into that, and then he also uses that sort of personal relationship with you then to sell you on his vision of the world and also his vision of the White House. And it's very compelling. Number 4, he hates reporters for show. He says that the media is the enemy of the people. He calls us fake news. He said that to me many times. And his chief of staff at one point made a joke about using a ceremonial sword on a journalist. So attacking reporters serves a purpose. It's fun for them. And it gives him a way to say, you and I are on the same side, and there's the media over there, and that's the enemy. It's a very effective bonding mechanism. But as a result, people hate journalists now more than ever. The Gallup poll shows that trust in media is the lowest that it's been in decades, and so they even ask the question. And it undermines trust in the institution in some very fundamental way. And number 5, what I've learned since covering the administration is the president talks about his hands a lot. He talks about his hands on Air Force One. When I was with him in Houston, we were in a shelter where there were people who had been evacuated, and he was serving meals, and he was putting on some gloves before he gave the meals out, and he was putting them on, and he's like, my hands are too big. So all I can say about that is it's probably good to keep in mind the advice that they said with journalists and the public in the beginning, which is that it's probably good not to take, the president just says stuff sometimes, so you don't want to take him too seriously or literally when he talks about his hands. His hands are normal-sized hands, just like your hands are my hands.
I'm glad we got that resolved, because that was... Catherine, what's been your experience?
Challenging, difficult. Let me say, thank you for having us. I'm thrilled to be at West Virginia University. I have relatives among your alumni, and it was a beautiful drive, a beautiful day, and thank you for taking the time of your evening to hear us and to ask us questions. And while we're talking, please think of good questions to pose to us. I came to Washington in 2000 as a journalist. I've been doing this professionally since I was 19, and that was a few years back. So covered the tail end of Bill Clinton, all 8 years of George W. Bush, all 8 years of Barack Obama, and now almost 9 months of Donald Trump. And a key thing for me is that I'm nonpartisan. I'm unbiased. The slogan is, when you come to Washington as a journalist, you have your partisan biases surgically removed. That's the only way to do business. And a key difference, however, is that as the Chicago Tribune's Washington reporter, we have a bureau of 30 covering the White House, the Congress, the agencies, the economy. I represented the hometown newspaper of Barack Obama. So we had people like Rahm Emanuel, now mayor, was his first chief of staff. David Axelrod, of course, was his political genius. Tina Chen was the longest-serving chief of staff for Mrs. Obama. Mrs. Obama, the two daughters were born and raised in Chicago. So this is a different animal. I'm not first chair for the Tribune. I'm more of an outside player. So when I relate to the Trump White House now, it's who is the U.S. attorney going to be? The number 2 person, now acting Secretary of the Army, is from Illinois. How is Trump relating to the Illinois members of Congress? Who's up, who's down, whose agenda meshes with the president or does not mesh with the president? I cover Dick Durbin, who's the number 2 Dem in the Senate, and the entire delegation. I find that, and let me address the fake news thing right out of the gate. It's a tactic or a strategy, call it what you want, but it lets him be at one time, and the same time, a bully and a victim. And I am here to tell you, and to tell the journalism students most particularly, that your obligation and your passion and what you want to do for the future is enshrined in our Constitution. You are here to find the truth and to speak truth to power and to ask questions on behalf of the American public, the American taxpayers, and the people from sea to shining sea. That's your job. And the fact that you have a temperamental president doesn't have anything to say about my job or how I go about my job or whether I will continue to ask the hard questions. I had one more point I wanted to make, and I guess it slipped my mind, so I'll get back to it. But thank you again for having us, and we look forward to a great evening.
Great, Catherine, thank you. Sarah?
Well, can you hear me? Oh, you can. So I think my experience covering the Trump administration is probably a little different than everyone else's, in that President Trump is the first president that I've covered. I finished school in 2015, and President Trump launched his campaign in June 2015, so a month after I was done. I've never really known anything different in this industry than having Trump dominate the headlines every day. So for me, the things that he does on a daily basis in terms of his interactions with the press don't seem as ridiculous. And sometimes I think that can be a bit of an advantage because I don't have the institutional memory to understand what kinds of norms he's breaking, and that's kind of what his campaign and his presidency has been all about. It's about disrupting what was the status quo. And I think, it's already been said that President Trump's antagonism towards the press is good for him. It riles up his base, but it's a symbiotic relationship. It's also been really good for the media. Political journalism is at a 10-year high watermark. People are more fascinated with the White House correspondents and political journalists than they have been in a really long time. Trump has made a lot of people pretty famous just by fighting with them on TV, and I think reporters secretly or maybe openly love it. I think that it has been great for ratings, great for business, so maybe it's damaging to the institution in the long run, but it certainly has been a gift to the industry of political reporting.
There's some really great themes here. Let's develop a couple of them. One is, I think from all of you, was Mark, you talked about criticizing, vilifying the media as a strategy. Tara, you talked about giving reporters grief for show. Catherine, you mentioned fake news is a tactic. So a lot of us, when we're consuming the news, we see the antagonistic briefing, we see the president point out, fake news, liars. But are you saying, Mark, it's a show, and really afterward it's like you all sit down and it's okay? I mean, he gets us all riled up, but it's a tactic, it's not real?
I do think that there is a difference between what the American public sees and what actually happens behind the scenes. And that isn't to say that we troop into his office and he's thrilled with our coverage. He calls our editors, he complains, his aides complain when they don't like certain kinds of stories. But the point that Tara made in particular, I think, is a really important one to understand. President Trump wants to have a relationship with the news media. I would argue he probably wants to have more of a relationship than his predecessor did.
Really?
Barack Obama's White House was, and I covered it for 5 years, a very difficult White House to cover. In some ways, a harder White House. Easier in other ways, and I'll explain. It was an extremely buttoned-down, closed shop.
Right.
It was very hard to get people to call you. And it was very hard to break out beyond a very carefully managed message that they wanted to put out. The president himself was reasonably inaccessible, fairly inaccessible. I'm not sure any less accessible than President Bush had been, but certainly no more. We had a handful of interviews with him in 8 years as a newspaper. The Washington Post, I believe, may have had 0 one-on-one interviews with him in 8 years, which is extraordinary if you think about it. President Trump, by contrast, has had our newspaper into the office 3-4 times. He's called a couple of reporters on the telephone.
So what's going on? I mean, that's fascinating, because I got to tell you, and maybe we'll get some questions here later on this, that's not what we get. That's not, because it looks extremely, and somebody else can address this, because or finish your answer, it seems extremely antagonistic, yet you're saying in some ways the access is better than it was.
Yeah, and then I'll throw to others, but I think that's exactly what, he doesn't want you, the American public, to really understand the nature of this relationship, because he has a tactical and strategic goal of vilifying the media, because it fits into his larger narrative of draining the swamp. We, the media, are part of the swamp that he has been sent in to drain. But I have to tell you, Donald Trump has been to our newspaper a couple of times. The last time he was there, he gave us a long-ranging, wide-ranging interview that lasted a couple hours. At the end of that interview, he said to our publisher and our executive editor that he viewed the New York Times as one of the gems of the American media world.
I thought it was the failing New York Times.
Well, maybe it's a failing gem. but the point is that the underlying relationship is not necessarily what you see. And that isn't to say that he doesn't have a great deal of anger against our newspaper from time to time. It's just much more complicated, and he is, as Tara said, a skilled user of the media, consumer of the media. He understands the media exceptionally well.
Well, somebody else weigh in on this, what is an obvious, Catherine, paradox.
I'll bring up a...
Yeah, just get close. You got to get close to that
I'll talk
mic.
a little bit about the Obama administration, because Mark is correct. They were very buttoned down. They wanted their story told. I had pushback on any number of stories. I'll give one example. Rahm Emanuel, again, the first chief of staff, probably, so Obama comes in 2009, probably maybe February of 2010. I started hearing whispers. Now, keep in mind, chiefs of staff last on average 20 months. So Reince Priebus didn't quite make it. We'll see what happens to General Kelly. But there were whispers that Rahm Emanuel, chief of staff to Obama, former congressman, wanted to run for Chicago mayor. So I stood up in my chair. I was probably reading this at breakfast, and I thought, oh my goodness, I had better get this story. And I got so much pushback for a week. Oh, you're not chasing that story, are you? Bed in the Post. You're going to follow a gossip columnist Well, Sally Quinn is not a gossip columnist. And guess what? Rahm did run for mayor and win. I didn't get confirmation from him that he was going to launch a mayor. Richard M. Daley was still in the White House. But I did look back at the 10 years of the chief of staff, talked about how churn was inevitable, talked to people close to Rahm. But, you know, for running blowback, I was on a fool's errand. I can think of other occasions too, but again, another big difference.
Let me ask, but did President Obama get better press than Trump, even though journalists live on access? They live on access, right?
Well,
but is Trump getting worse press than Obama, even though you got better access than you had with Obama?
Yeah, because he's always yelling at us. I mean, the relationship is really complicated. In the beginning, I thought that President Trump hated journalists. You know, I was there in that press briefing that you saw in Trump Tower when he was like yelling at Jim Acosta, and I was like, Jesus, what's he gonna say to me? And I had my hand up to be called on, but in a way, I kind of didn't want to be called on because it was just like, it was kind of scary. And then he would say things like, you know, like Steve Bannon did an interview with the New York Times, and Steve Bannon was like, you guys should be humiliated because you lost the election. You know, it was just all these attacks. And then when I started to, you know, I'm part of the press pool, which is it's called the protective press pool. So you travel with the president. And I started to see him in action, and I realized it's kind of a scam. He's friends with journalists behind the scenes. He hangs out with them. He knows us really, really well. And it's not like, I wouldn't say friends, it's kind of an exaggeration, but the relationship is super close, and he does that thing, which is that I was describing, is he, you know, hones in on you. And once I was we were on Air Force One, it was maybe 4 or 5 of us journalists, and he was like, you know, focusing on someone and telling her all these things, and he was yelling at us. And then afterwards, I asked the journalist, like, so how long have you known him? She's like, I never met him until today. So, you know, he finds somebody that he sees maybe as like a weaker member of the group, and then he bonds with them, and then creates a different dynamic within the group. He sort of like, you know, messes up the herd mentality, and it's a really powerful tool.
That's Sarah, because this is the first president you've covered, and again, for others who are a little older, they see this change, they see a different dynamic. Do you just look at this now and go, this is how it is, man? Grow a set and get in there and go for it. Is that how?
Well, you know, I think that President Trump is really unique, I mean, from my experience, in that
it's unique historically.
Yeah, all right, good. Thank you for the confirmation. He speaks to a lot of people outside the White House really frequently, really candidly. And so one way that I think a lot of journalists have been able to understand what's happening inside the White House is to talk to people outside the White House. And, you know, to a certain extent, Chief of Staff John Kelly has started to crack down on that a little bit. But the flow of information surrounding the White House has been just really thick. I mean, you kind of always understand what the president is doing, whereas, from my understanding, that wasn't the case in the Obama administration. And you're right, Obama, I think, undoubtedly got better press than President Trump in almost every respect.
Why?
Can I jump in?
Let me ask you, sir, because you work for what is generally thought to be a more conservative publication. So is there a bias? Let's get to it. Is there a bias?
Yes, I think there's undoubtedly a bias in the press corps. I think you can look at any figure that more reporters are Democrat than Republican by overwhelming margins, that political journalists are concentrated in areas that vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. I think that you can look at the way that certain stories are covered in the Trump administration versus the way they were covered in past administrations. I mean, to give you an example, earlier in the administration, President Trump went to his Justice Department and he asked all of the remaining U.S. attorneys to resign. And that was covered breathlessly as this purge of the Justice Department, that they're getting rid of all the attorneys. And it turns out that this is something actually that presidents do frequently. Later at the State Department, there were some officials who resigned at the top of the State Department. The Washington Post reported this as a mass exodus of staffers and protests of the new Trump administration. They were asked to resign. It was normal. When the climate change information disappeared off of whitehouse.gov, this was reported as the Trump White House purging climate change data from the government archives, when really every new administration comes in and the old administration's content is archived and they get to build their own whitehouse.gov. So these stories were covered in the most negative light that journalists could find just because it's President Trump.
Okay, everybody weigh
Jump in?
in here. Is
Yeah,
there, go ahead. Go
to
ahead,
a good
Catherine. Is
point-
there a bias? Is there a liberal bias? We'll go right down the line here.
The examples you gave are really good, and you can track it. You can look at, liberal media and see how they cover the Trump administration. And there, statistically, there are more negative stories about the Trump administration than there were about the Obama administration. And the State Department example is a good one. These people who work in these agencies do leave, and it's not a big deal. But President Trump is so dramatic. It's like he throws stuff out there, and he's shouting, and he's making everything seem chaotic. He's firing people all of the time. So it's like you're covering a reality show. So, it's exciting and dramatic, but it's also generated by the president himself.
Okay, Catherine, is there a liberal bias?
I would say that I really am not an academic. I haven't systematically looked at coverage of Obama versus coverage of Trump, but we haven't used the P word, poll. 9 months in, just short of 9 months in, the last I saw, Trump's approval rating for the American public was 38%. And I would say some of his wounds are self-inflicted. I would also agree that if you look historically, yes, journalists probably skew Democratic, but let's remember 1/3 of the country are independents, and regardless of how you vote, which I think is our right and privilege to vote, you don't approach things D or R. I certainly don't. I work for a middle-of-the-road publication, and I'm proud to be an unbiased reporter. And guess what? I'm also an American. I want this country to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
So starting with that, the reason the press may like Trump in a certain way, he is a former reality TV showman. He's full of drama and chaos and disruption compared to no drama Obama. This is a White House that is very leaky. It's plagued by infighting, and it's plagued by fellow staffers in the West Wing throwing each other under the bus. And I was talking on Monday, actually, to a former Obamaite. I had to do a story. This person got a new job and is back in Chicago. And it just, the words came to me, no drama Obama. He was not a perfect president. I'm not here to defend his administration or his decisions or his legacy. In fact, when we write stories about the Obama Library, one thing to keep in mind is we're not even 9 months in. The true story of the arc of a presidency is really going to be determined down the road when we have the passage, when time passes and we can take the measure. And it also will be told when the archives are released and you know what the aides were thinking and how decisions were made. And so I'm not sure how to sum up except that I would again say to the journalism students, your job is to square your shoulders and go out there and do your job. And journalism is not all about Washington. I spent many, many years in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, working for the newspaper there. I was a national reporter traveling the country. I've done some overseas work, as some of the other panelists have. And another thing that we haven't talked about is, fake news. I get trolled. I get asked about my mental health. I get told I'm the poorest excuse for a journalist that ever lived. Thank you very much. And there was also, starting about in the spring, a new tenor to certain emails. I had a conversation for a story with a tax attorney in Washington, and it was a tough time for him to take the time to talk to me. He had a loss in his family, but he still talked to me. And I said, Ed, thank you very much. I really appreciate you helping me out here, understanding something complex. And he replied, don't thank me. I'm just grateful that you get up every morning and do the work that you do. So there's been also, I see, and I think Pew found it was probably more among Democrats, but there also is a new appreciation for the hard work that we do. And I will also just say to the journalism students, it's not just the White House that it's the front lines. Journalism is a tough business. It's a search for the truth. I salute all the journalists in the southern states now covering the floods. And so it's a great business. We love it. All of us here on stage, we do it because it's a passion. And it's not easy, irrespective of who the president is, but it's a wonderful thing to do and be.
Mark, let me ask you, because as a reporter for the New York Times, you've never been asked if there's a liberal bias. Is there a liberal bias?
Well, first of all, it depends on what we're talking about.
Okay.
Because the media consists of a great many extremely different
it's not
institutions.
monolithic. It's
the highest rated 24-hour cable news channel for most of the last decade was Fox News, which is hardly liberal. In the last few years in particular, there's been a growth of extremely influential, very hard right websites like Breitbart, which has had a huge influence on this administration. The Wall Street Journal, which is one of the largest papers by circulation in the United States, has a right-of-center editorial page, has been notably soft even in its news columns on Donald Trump. So I think that it's kind of lazy in a way to say, oh, the liberal media. Well, it depends on what media you're talking about. Now, to confront the question directly, all of us approach what we do with a cultural and geographic bias. That's absolutely unavoidable. It's who we are. If I spend 10 years living in New York City, it means that I think and view the world a certain way, and to pretend otherwise is hypocritical. That said, I think it's very hard for me to point to cases where me or my colleagues come into work and sit around and scheme about how to hurt Republicans and help Democrats. And if anything, I'd almost make the opposite case. In our effort to prove that we're not the liberal media, we give Democrats a pretty hard time. Bill Clinton famously complained to the New York Times that we did nothing but slam him for the first 2 years of his presidency. And our publisher once said to him in a meeting in the Oval Office, we think of it as tough love. And Clinton said, I'd like more of the love and less of the tough. So that was the Clinton administration. The Obama administration, which I covered, was unhappy with our coverage on a great many issues that I was personally involved in. I wrote any number of negative stories about his unwillingness to do more to stop the slaughter in Syria during the Civil War. I wrote about his unwillingness to do more after the fall of Gaddafi to stabilize the situation there. We wrote endless articles about his unwillingness to reach across the aisle, his lack of a willingness to roll up his sleeves and make deals with Republicans. So I think that it's easy to talk about the liberal media, but the reality is a lot more complicated.
Yeah. What about, though, and this is fascinating stuff because, again, I think that sometimes consumers are seeing something different than what you're describing is really going on. Because we see this very, very antagonistic relationship, the clips that the dean showed, and frankly, that gets a lot of folks riled up, okay? And they get mad at the media. So do you all have a responsibility? Is anybody falling short here of not reporting, look, I know he gives us a hard time, but he's not really serious about that. I mean, is anybody reporting on the tactics? Anybody? Tara?
I mean, I'll just say that there are tactics that are being used, the ones that we've talked about, but it's also, there's a lot of hostility that he generates. So when I go out with him in the pool and we go somewhere for a rally, he'll say these things about the media and they put us in like these cages, like these pens, you know? And you walk into this like huge auditorium of all these people who hate the media, and it's a little intimidating. So like
So there's a part that's real, I mean, a very real part of it too.
So, yeah, and so my strategy has been when I go into these groups where, you know, President Trump is saying enemy of the people and, you know, fake news. So, and people are yelling at us, is like I'll try to look at individuals in the group so that when they lynch mob us, at least I'll know, you know, what color eyes they have. You know, it's like there's nothing fake about that.
Okay. But
can I just raise one point? I mean, I think we also need to accept the fact that this hasn't been a normal presidency. I mean, you can be a Republican or a Democrat, but you have to acknowledge that the circumstances under which President Trump was elected and the actions he's taken since he's been elected are unprecedented in the modern American presidency. This is a president who fired his FBI director, and on the first day said, the reason I fired him is because he mistreated Hillary Clinton in his investigation of her emails. And then 2 days later, told Lester Holt in an interview, actually, that's not true at all. I fired him because he didn't exonerate me in the Russia investigation. And that's just one of a number of things that are wholly unprecedented in modern White Houses. And so to sort of do an apples to apples comparison between Trump's coverage and Obama's coverage, or Trump's coverage and George Bush's coverage, I would argue doesn't make a lot of sense because we are really dealing with a completely different kind of situation. And I think that inevitably that's going to make us look more antagonistic, and I would argue it's simply us holding him accountable.
What about this? And Sarah, I want to come to you on this, or whatever direction you want to go. Is that I think that's a really good point, Mark, but that it's certainly legitimate journalism to say Monday he said this and Wednesday he said this, which is diametrically opposed to what he said Monday. Okay, that's legitimate journalism. Does it go farther? And probably the better examples on the cable channels or talk radio, whatever, to say, well, the president is a liar. The president is unstable because he says one thing one day and one day the next. Because on cable channels, that's where that conversation sometimes goes. Sarah, you want to speak to that?
It does, and I think, that's one of the reasons why people don't trust the media. Sometimes they ascribe motives to President Trump that aren't necessarily there. During the campaign, he was frequently attacked and not always by journalists, sometimes by political commentators, but one of the problems is that the lines between political commentators and journalists have been blurring increasingly as media moves more towards, cable and being concentrated in these highly partisan outlets because people want to read information that confirms what they already believe. So I think that, in some ways, the nuance of the argument that Mark makes is correct, but people who don't read journalism every day, who only consume it, in the mornings before they go to work or whatever, don't really process those nuances. They see a President Obama who has asked questions at press conferences like, what enchants you about living in the White House? Whereas President Trump has shouted questions at him about, everything under the sun negative, always about, are you going to fire your son-in-law? Who are you fighting with today? And
But how much of that is self-inflicted by him?
A lot of it is self-inflicted by him. I mean, part of what Mark described, that episode with FBI Director James Comey, I think stems from President Trump's desire to serve as his own spokesman at all times. He doesn't, when his press team fails him, that's when you see him talking to the pool or inviting journalists into his Oval Office. He has hosted a lot more journalists in the Oval Office than previous presidents. I've sat down in the Oval Office and spoken with him myself. He's very welcoming to journalists. But I think that the nuance is correct, but if you look, bird's eye view of Obama coverage versus Trump coverage, that's where people are getting the bias from. They see that President Obama was not, Republicans in particular, feel he wasn't treated with the rigor that he should have been, and then they see Trump being treated with the kind of rigor that probably all presidents should be subjected to.
I would respectfully disagree.
Wait, where are we?
My mic's not working.
Hand your mic over to her.
Thank you. Hello, thank you. So, look, that's total cherry picking with all respect. Of course, during 8 years...
What was that, total what?
Cherry picking.
Okay.
During a long campaign...
The media never does that, by the way.
Leading up to 2008 and 8 years in office, I can assure you that asking Obama what he was enchanted by in the White House is a softball, but as Mark points out, he faced tough questions about Syria, about Libya, about everything under the sun. He took office in a great recession. The economy was hemorrhaging. Detroit was about to go bankrupt. There were a lot of hard decisions that he and his team faced. Again, I'm not here the Obama apologist, okay? I don't have the perspective or the intellect. But again, we have a former reality TV show person in that job, which is the leader of the Western world. And let me just go to a micro level and switch gears a little bit. It's been said that Trump could not, as a person who's not an establishment Republican, did not exactly, in not every case, was able to attract the biggest talent on his staff. Now, that's not a blanket criticism of the White House. I happen to respect what General Kelly's trying to do, which is normalize things there. Kelly has a chief of staff he brought in. Within days, we learned in the paper that that woman is nicknamed Nurse Ratched, the stern nurse from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because people don't like being excluded from meetings. People don't like meetings that are principals only. People resent that. Well, look, I'm sure for every president in history, there's been a lot of behind-the-scenes drama, right? But there's certain things as a citizen I really don't need to know, and I think the infighting and the backbiting on the staff has got to be, however interesting it is, it's counterproductive to his agenda. And what of his agenda has he accomplished to date, I would ask? Hurricane relief is fine, good. God bless them. God bless FEMA. God bless all the victims. I wish them well, and I wish them recovery. But I'd ask anybody in this panel to point to, besides last week's Democratic decision, we're not going to worry about the debt ceiling, we're going to have a CR. What of the Trump agenda has been accomplished? And I'm all ears, because I would like to hear.
And we're going to get to questions here in just a couple minutes. Tara, let me take this to a different part here, because what are the implications, if there are any, on journalism and even the country? Because if the trend now is to vilify the press, or the press you don't agree with, or if there's something you don't agree with, then it's wrong, and if Trump is going to use the press as a vehicle, maybe successfully, are there broader implications for journalism, for the country? What do you think?
Yeah, of course there are. The broader implications are about the truth. What is the truth? President Trump has a way of shifting things around. And when you're with him, you're going along with it. You're like listening to his stories. And one of my colleagues says it's a little bit like Harold and the Purple Crayon. You know, he takes this purple crayon around and he draws this town, this city, and everybody, you follow him and you watch what he does and you're like amazed. And the way that there is these discrepancies between his account earlier in the week about why he fired the FBI general and how it changed later, you kind of don't care because you're caught up in the story. And through this mechanism, President Trump creates a new reality. And that means that facts become alternate facts. Thank you, Kellyanne Conway, one of my favorite people in the White House. And you start to see things in a different way. So I think these implications are fundamental to who we are as a country. And
Right, Mark, what do you think? What are the broader implications of what's going on here, Mark?
Well, I think Tara, hit on the germ of the problem, and it does very much go to this notion that, Daniel Patrick Moynihan had this famous line that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own set of facts. Facts are universal. We have to agree on what the facts are. And if you progressively degrade the whole notion of facts and truth, you can't actually have an informed debate about anything in American society. And I think that's probably, of all the things he's done, potentially the most troubling. I mean, look, like Tara, I've been at a few of these rallies and had people glare at me and shout horrible things, and I'll deal with that. That's like an occupational hazard, and I don't even take it that personally. What I do worry about is that my children will grow up in a world where there are no agreed upon facts, and to go to what Sarah said earlier about the fact that the media world is increasingly splintering in a way where we only consume the media that confirms our biases and reinforces our opinions. And I think that is being accelerated also by, a strategy of vilification and a strategy of, only using certain media outlets for certain things. So I think that's the thing that troubles me the most about it. And I would just note, it's not just the media. Donald Trump, don't forget, has also launched a fairly full frontal assault on the courts. He has questioned the even-handedness of judges and what their motives are. He has specifically questioned the value of judgments that were made on his initial immigration executive order, and I think that, by the way, is every bit as serious as what he's doing with the media. There's a number of institutions in this country that we rely on. We happen to have a great deal of we of course will defend the media, but you could get a panel of legal scholars up here, and I think they would be every bit as troubled about what he's doing with the courts.
Sarah, do you have an opinion on that, and are there broader implications where if everybody's sort of just tuning into media that reinforces their preconceived notions, then there's no agreed upon facts? How do you have debates? How do you have debates about issues? How do you reach compromise, which is a dirty word? I mean, where's it all headed?
Right, I think Mark's talking about a strategy of vilification against the media. I think that strategy of vilification is so successful because there was already an existing mistrust of the media in America. And so President Trump recognized that and he exploited it. He certainly did not cause it. And maybe he's accelerating this fracturing within the industry because liberals are more fired up than ever. They want to go read about the resistance in outlets that present it in the fairest light. Republicans want to go watch Fox News, read Breitbart. They want to have see President Trump praised in the media. And so that is, I think, a huge problem, because then there's no middle ground where what's happening is just being laid out without any kind of varnish.
So so then, Catherine, so are the media just getting the kick in the groin everybody wanted to give you all along anyway?
So far as I know, the Washington Post and the New York Times they're doing quite well, and they're also doing quite well because of Trump, because people are looking for facts. They're looking for answers. And I would also note, in terms of the full frontal assault on the judiciary that Mark brought up, look at what Trump has done to senior Republicans in the Congress. These people are theoretically his allies to push his agenda. And I concur. Obama did not do a good job of, he served in the Senate, in the US Senate briefly, but he seemed to have a disconnect. Biden had it, but he didn't understand that you do have to go over to the Capitol. You do have to make nice with those lawmakers. They're your appropriators. They set the budget. They approve your nominees. But again, Trump is always on attack so much. It was brought up earlier. Let me address a point that was made earlier too, which is, calling the president unstable. I have never done that. I don't really know of a journalist who has done that per se, a straight news journalist as I am. I know psychological groups have made that statement by violating the Goldwater rule and doing so. But let's just go back to day one of the Trump presidency, okay? I covered his inauguration. That was my 6th inauguration that I covered. It was the first inauguration that was followed by a women's march, chiefly women's march, probably about 200,000 strong. Trump went to the CIA in front of the Wall of Honor. These are slain CIA agents who, serving this country, gave their life. And that's when we began the false narrative of how huge his inauguration crowds were. So we've heard that time and again. For the sake of the country, I hope they get their act together. I hope they figure out their agenda, and I hope they work with Congress and advance an agenda, because Lord knows this country has issues.
Mark, you want to make a point here?
I just wanted to add one thing. When Steve Bannon told our reporter, the media is the opposition party, he in a way was pointing out it was a very important warning to all of us, because the worst thing we could do is become the opposition party. Basically what we have to do is stay away from confirming the biases of either side. In other words, conservatives are always going to say the liberal media, the liberal New York Times, but we have an issue with the left as well. And that issue is that they want the New York Times to be another version of Huffington Post. They want the New York Times to never, ever recognize a constructive or productive thing that President Trump has done. And I'll give you a very specific example of this. A couple of weeks ago, we were noticing that President Trump was very engaged in the planning for Hurricane Harvey. He was up at Camp David, but he was having repeated meetings with his cabinet. He was tweeting. Now, some of those tweets were a little off-key. He was a little too excited about the size of the storm. But he showed a level of engagement that he has not shown on other things, tax reform, health care. And so we decided to write a story saying that. And the story had plenty of balance to it. It pointed out that some of the tweets may have struck some as inappropriate. It pointed out that he was praising FEMA before the hurricane actually hit, which put him in the slight danger of doing what George Bush did after Hurricane Katrina, where, if you remember, he praised his FEMA director, and then the city of New Orleans was promptly inundated for weeks. And so we wrote a story, nevertheless, that said, this shows a level of engagement we haven't seen from the president. Story posted at 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. Within a half an hour, I had gotten crucified on Twitter, absolutely raked over the coals in a much more hostile way, frankly, than half a dozen really negative stories I'd written about Trump. And these were people who probably think the New York Times' job is to point out that this guy is a crazy monster and to do it every single day. And when you deviate from that, they get very angry at you. So I think it's very important, and my colleagues and I have talked about this a lot, that we be willing to write them, call them as we see them, and be very aware of the fact that we're going to be, to use a word that's been used too much up here today, we're going to be vilified by people on the left. And I honestly believe that if I'm getting a lot of fire from the left and from the right, that might be about the best indication that I'm getting the balance right.
Let's open it up for some questions here for a little bit. So we got we got mics. So we have two roaming mountaineers, yellow shirts with the mic. So who would like to ask a question of our panel, make a comment? Yes, sir. Sure, stand up. You can ask a specific panelist or make a question or point, whatever you'd like to do. Go ahead.
Has there been an effort by Trump's team to limit his Twitter use at all, or is that just his discretion?
Seriously? Who could do that? I mean, I suppose they do try, but nobody has had any success in trying to rein him in.
I'd actually say I think John Kelly is moving in that direction, and I actually think if you look at the last couple of weeks, it's been a little more subdued. So I think it's going to be an uphill struggle, as Tara says, but I do think that they have kind of given him the message that there are certain types of tweets you might want to stay away from, or at the very least, if you're going to make certain assertions on Twitter, maybe run the facts and figures past the staff beforehand. And there's some evidence he's done that.
Next, there's a lady here, back here too, or this. Yes, sir.
Is this on?
Yep.
Does the fact that Trump is a pathological liar make the press the enemy of the people?
People talk about whether or not the president lies. That comes up a lot. It's certainly a conversation among journalists that I know. And one definition of a lie is you do it deliberately. So much of what the president says seems to me to sort of be in the moment. He just says stuff, and he says it to convince you and to sell you. And sometimes it's not true, but it's difficult to it's difficult to untangle all of that. And the best thing that we can do is tell you guys what he told us.
Sarah?
Lie is a pretty loaded word, and probably until recently, I think it was one that journalists were almost universally instructed to stay away from, because you can't get inside a politician's head or a public figure's head and know if they knew they were telling the truth, know if they deliberately misrepresented what's accurate. So that's something that we as journalists are supposed to stay away from, and I think that one way bias has manifested itself in the way the press coverages the Trump administration is by ascribing motives to things that they do without actually knowing the full story. Like the examples that I cited, it was assumed that President Trump was going on some kind of crusade against the government when he was just doing something ordinary. Or maybe if he watches a Fox News segment and then he fires off a tweet based off of it, it's assumed that he's trying to put out propaganda when really he's just, interacting with conservative media in a public way. So I think that the term lying is something we are really supposed to avoid, and we've seen that norm kind of be eroded. That's one problem the Trump administration has ushered in, I think.
Catherine?
I would just chime in. I'm not really sure where you saw the president in a standard middle-of-the-road publication or broadcast outlet called a liar, but just look at the rise of the so-called PolitiFact columns that do take a deep dive into what are very complex issues. And there's the liar, liar, pants on fire meter is one of them. And they did it to Hillary, they did it to Obama, they're doing it to Trump. You have to take these people to task and look at real facts versus what's being said. The other point I want to make is that we can't lose sight of the rapidly changing technology. Now, the Obamas were on Twitter, they were on Instagram, but that is a relatively new phenomenon in our history. Hence, you have a vehicle for Trump to say he's going to rain fire and fury down on North Korea, which is perhaps an intemperate thing to say, and the military experts said, arguably, perhaps threatened to box Trump in terms of what his alternatives were in a very volatile and dangerous part of the world. I would make that point. And also with respect to being trolled or getting hate mail, yes, we get a lot of it. And like Mark, sometimes I get, for the very same story, not even the biggest story or the most sensational story, not a story I'm gonna like put in my scrapbook, I hear equally from Democrats and from Republicans what a bad journalist I am, how wrong I have it, you're a poor excuse for a reporter. And I would note that I've been in this business long enough that I long often for the days when a reader would either call me on the phone. Talking on the phone is a much more intimate way of communicating than firing off an angry email, because under my byline it says contact the writer. So we make it very easy for people to treat me like, let's just say, as nicely as you do your cable TV company or your phone service provider. That's just the nature of the way things are right now. And so technology has changed so fast. It's become more impersonal. It's become quicker and in certain ways more antagonistic, I would say. So with respect to when you write to me and you call me bad names and you say this and that, oftentimes I will tell people, dear Mr. Jones, thank you for taking the time to read my story. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you taking the time to share your views with me. However, I have a policy. I do not respond to email with profanities. You're welcome to try again. And I get two responses. I get the tail between the legs, oh, Miss Skiba, I'm so sorry, I lost my cool. And that's one response. The other one is like, boom, 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 up the ante, and I'll get more of it in my face. But like I said, I've got a job to do, been doing it a long time, and thank you very much. I don't respond to emails with profanities.
That's a damn shame.
I remember that.
Question right here. You have a question? He's got, grab the mic there. Thank you.
Today we've spoken a lot about the vilification of media. Would you say the media has brought any of this on itself by amplifying racial hostility with their coverage?
Okay, have you brought any of this on yourselves? And you want to particularly do with the race issue? You want to do with the race issue, how race issues are covered? That's Tara, anybody want to tackle that?
The question of like how much is the media to blame for the vilification of the media is a really good one. And it's something that I talk about with my colleagues a lot. Journalists need to take into account that, you know, we as journalists are hated. That's really important. I don't have the answers for where it comes from. In terms of the racial dynamic, I also am not sure what that means in terms of how the press is perceived or how the media is seen. These are questions that we have. To pretend as though it's enough for us to do our jobs and end of story, I think that that's not enough. I think that we need to take into account the way people see us and how that's changed with time and what we are doing in our jobs that brings on such wrath.
Would it help, and I'm not saying that you all should give up your seats at the White House, those prime seats at the White House, but would it help, and I guess the Times has a huge staff, you can get out more, if more reporters really got out of Washington and instead of hanging on every word that happens there and go out and see what's happening across the country? Is that one of the reasons that a lot of people miss the Trump phenomenon?
I think there are very valid criticisms to be made of the way the media covers elections. I think that some of the criticism is misplaced. For example, to speak about our newspaper, I think that our practice, which became really, really emphasized in the last election, to constantly run predictors every day on our homepage. Hillary has a 64% chance of winning or 72% chance of winning. I don't think anyone feels that was a particularly constructive exercise in hindsight. It made us look a bit silly when we went from 62% to 99% in a 1 hour period on election night. So I'm sure we'll be rethinking that. As to the question of should we get out more into the country, it's kind of lost in all the noise, but we sent tons of reporters out into the country. And we wrote a lot about the hollowing out of manufacturing, about the hopelessness in communities, about the opioid crisis, about what was driving white working class resentment. These are not actually issues that we ignored. If you go back and look, we wrote a great deal about them. Now, I'm not going to argue with you that those stories were played as prominently as they should have been, because unfortunately the horse race mentality in election coverage is so extreme that it tends to crowd out the policy stories and the on-the-ground stories. So the answer is, of course, we should get out into the world. And, you know, I will say, though, on the question of would we have correctly predicted this election, absolutely not. I defy anyone to tell me when an election turned on 77,000 votes in 3 states that sending more people out, even to Wisconsin and Michigan, necessarily would have brought us to come to a different prediction for the outcome of this election. This election, as Bill Kristol has said, was kind of a triple bank shot. That doesn't mean that it's not our job to go out and write more about the issues that were driving voters in this election. I think we all learned an important lesson. We probably will commit more resources to that in the next election.
Question right here, the lady in the middle. Can you get her a microphone?
You want to hold it too? Okay. Oh, okay. So earlier when we were watching the video on Trump vilifying the media, everyone was laughing. I think that a big part of my confusion about vilifying the media is that many presidents behind closed doors act how he acts out to the public. Barack Obama, probably not a perfect guy, but he had a very composed, no drama Obama thing about him. With Donald Trump, is it good for our president to be somebody who's so silly and laughed upon?
But I don't think he's laughed upon. I don't think people laugh at Donald Trump or President Trump. He's a fascinating character. And if anyone's laughing at him, they're going to be laughing at themselves. It's somebody that we need to watch really carefully. So I disagree.
Anybody else?
I think that...
Sir, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the problems with covering Trump actually did start during the campaign. I think a lot of journalists didn't think he was going to win and didn't think they needed to necessarily cover him as seriously as they would as someone who had a good chance of becoming the next president. So in a lot of ways, I think particularly around the time of the Access Hollywood tape, there was the shift. It was happening before, it's happened after, but where reporters used the fact that President Trump said racist things and sexist things and misogynistic things to drop their pretense of objectivity, because it was no longer a difference of this policy or that policy. They viewed it as a difference between right and wrong. And there were a lot of people who liked what President Trump was saying because it's the way they talk around their dinner table, it's the way they talk out on the golf course or the locker room, as President Trump would say. And they didn't see how all of the stuff Trump was saying was that offensive. So they liked what they were hearing from President Trump, and they didn't like it when reporters were characterizing this as something that should be, outraged, banned, he should drop out of the race. People rolled their eyes at that, and they stopped taking the news seriously every time they get hysterical about something that someone might say to their partner at the dinner table.
Can I just add one thing?
Of course.
I'm going to take slight issue with this. I think Sarah's right that was a big part of his appeal to his base. I think that the problem we have now is he's speaking and saying things in a way that's just completely unpresidential. And he may believe he's redefining the job or recasting the job of president, but the rest of the world doesn't understand that. And I think the danger here is, particularly if you're a leader in a foreign country, an ally or an enemy, a potential would-be enemy, some of the unpredictability, the impulsiveness, the illogic, the blustering threats, those are deeply destabilizing to this country and to the world. And I often think that the issue with President Trump is, I think he wakes up in the morning sometimes and forgets he's president and thinks, I'm just going to say the stuff I said during the campaign. That's what people liked about me. The problem is you can't do that when you're president. And then just one final point on this. Mm-hmm. For him to come out in the wake of the racial clashes in Charlottesville and declare that both sides bear responsibility for this. When one side included in its ranks, not completely, but included in its ranks, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, KKK people, I just think is a surrender of the moral leadership that presidents exert in this country. Presidents, in this kind of very secular, very splintered society, we rely on presidents to chart the moral course for the country. And I think for him to draw a moral equivalence between both sides in Charlottesville was perhaps the single most troubling thing he's done as president, and it's our job as journalists to point that out, and also to point out how completely ahistorical this is. You can't find a president, no matter how Republican, no matter how conservative, who would not have condemned that outright. And I think it's important for us to do that and for it not to be ambiguous.
Let's take, we got one more. We're going to take one more question and we're going to wrap it up. Yes, ma'am.
My name none of you mentioned Russia. Okay, about the campaign having been involved with Russia and Russia's interference. And I would like to also remark on I'm sorry, I can't think of your name, ma'am.
Tara?
No, the next one.
Catherine?
Catherine. Your remarks are excellent and very, very seasoned. Very seasoned. And the New York Times, of course, I read on my phone.
So,
Can't afford your subscription.
So Russia, in particular, the question about Russia is, I'm sorry,
Yes.
Are there thoughts on it?
Yes.
On the scan? Okay.
Please.
All right, everybody, we'll wrap it up. I'll make a quick comment about the Russian story. We'll just start at the other end. Sarah, where do you think that's going?
I mean, I don't think we really know what it is or where it's going yet. Obviously, it's really important for the FBI to look into this. Obviously, it's really serious when a winning presidential campaign is under not just FBI investigation, but a special counsel had to be appointed because there were concerns about the impartiality of the Justice Department. So obviously, that's very serious, but the reality is that we have no idea what or if anything happened, and so to treat it like it's a foregone conclusion that President Trump colluded with the Russians, I think is a little unfair. I do think that we should wait to see what happens and cover it as, an unfolding investigation that hasn't yet produced fruit beyond, maybe some tiny little pieces of fruit. But it's something that is not the Watergate type scandal yet that it is sometimes characterized
Catherine,
to be.
You want to weigh in? Where's it going?
I respectfully disagree with the lady I had the pleasure of driving up here with today, and tell you there's two things to think about. It was the consensus of our intelligence agencies and top officials have testified before Congress. The Russians hacked our election. They hacked it to the benefit of Donald Trump and to the disadvantage of Hillary Clinton. And if you don't believe me, look at Mr. Brennan, the former CIA director's recent testimony before Capitol Hill. State election boards, offices, including the state of Illinois, there was the majority of states, they were hacked. The issue is, was there collusion? And that's a story that is unfolding. I have a lot of respect for Bob Mueller. He's leading a team of attorneys looking at that. The Senate Judiciary Committee is looking at that. The Senate Intelligence Committee is looking at that. The House Intelligence Committee is looking at that. And I believe the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia is looking at that. People would argue that this is a five-ring situation. Some people I've talked to on the committees, lawmakers, wish there was a little bit more cooperation. I would say TBD, but this is not tiny fruit. And that should be of concern to all Americans when an enemy, a historic enemy, an historic powerful enemy, is tampering with our election. I don't care who you vote for, I hope you vote. But that's something that should alarm everybody, and I urge you to pay attention to it. And we're all watching how this ends. But it's very premature to say this is not Watergate. We just don't know. And I have a lot of respect again for Mr. Mueller. He took the job as head of the FBI after a very distinguished career 1 week after 9/11, and he did an admirable job. So what happens next in coming months, we'll all be watching and reading with you. Thank you.
Tara?
When it comes to Russia, the president is sensitive about the issue. People who work for the CIA or the other intelligence agencies said that in the early days, President Trump would never ask questions about Russia. He just wasn't interested in finding out more about that subject. I was once in the Oval Office when President Trump, he does these signings of executive orders, which you've probably seen on television. And on one of these days when he was signing the orders, they were on his desk, and then someone shouted out a question, a reporter, "Mr. President, tell us about," and it was a question about Russia, and President Trump left the room without signing the executive orders. So we're all standing there, just like it's this weird moment. I mean, even Steve Bannon was embarrassed because it was not supposed to happen. So there's a nerve that gets struck anytime questions about Russia come up. At the same time, President Trump is very keen to develop a relationship with Putin. He wants to have some sort of working partnership with him so he can resolve big questions like Syria and Ukraine. President Trump sees it as a way to fix things and has told me and other reporters that Mr. Trump believes that he can control the relationship and come up with a good result. And it's possible that would happen, but it's possible that there'll be problems with going down that path. And as you remember, the last thing I'll say about this is during the campaign, Donald Trump used to talk about autocratic leaders in a way that was very somehow appreciative. So there's certain sort of sensibility that President Trump has about these authoritarian leaders that makes a person think that they should watch that very carefully.
Mark.
Those are all good points, and I'll only add this. I think that this is one area where the press, and in particular newspapers, have the ability to really contribute, because we have deployed enormous resources against the Russia investigation, and I think, and more broadly, into an investigation of Donald Trump's business ties, because I think that that's at the heart of understanding what happened with Russia. This is not a president who's released his income tax returns, so we don't know the sources of his income except in a very general way. So there's a lot of material that needs to be ferreted out to help us understand why, for example, he seems so reluctant to engage on Russia, so reluctant to criticize Vladimir Putin. His own family members have said in the past, Eric Trump, that a lot of the revenue that the company, the Trump organization, got in recent years did come from Russian investors. That doesn't necessarily equal collusion, but it certainly raises a lot of questions. And I do think one thing I'm proud of, and I'm not personally proud because I'm not an investigative reporter, but I'm really proud of my colleagues. We've broken a lot of important stories on Russia, who in the Trump organization met with Russian officials, what was said in meetings. We've traced a lot of the business ties. I think it's still only the tip of the iceberg. The Washington Post is hammering away at this. It's probably the greatest newspaper rivalry that we've had since the Watergate years. That's not to say that this is necessarily another Watergate. I do think it's extremely troubling, and probably more important than what I do every day is what those investigative reporters do, because they're the ones that will really be able to help figure out whether there is a story here.
Before we leave, I'm going to ask you for 2 rounds of applause. First will be for the School of Media, Dean Mary Ann Reed, Krista Curry and her staff, David Hardesty. Thank you. This has been part of the David Hardesty Jr. Festival of Ideas, and a really great event here this evening, and thank you all for coming out. And a big round of applause for a panel who've worked today and drove over here and probably be back at work tomorrow. Great job. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks for coming. Dean, anything else?
A big hand for Happy
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Have a great night, everybody.